Do you even have money in this account, ma'am? The voice was sharp, dismissive, and dripping with sarcasm. It cut through the quiet murmur of the bank like a knife. Everyone in the long line froze, their ears turning toward the counter where the words had been spoken. At the front stood an elderly black woman. Her back was slightly hunched, her movements slow but graceful, the kind of dignity that only comes with age and a lifetime of struggle. She was dressed neatly in a faded blue dress, her silver-grey hair pulled into a bun that revealed her delicate, weathered features. In her hands, she clutched a small, worn-out brown handbag, one she had carried faithfully for years. That bag had seen hospital trips, grocery stores, church Sundays, and now this bank. It carried not just money, but memories. But at that very moment, it felt like the bag wasn't the only thing being weighed down. Her heart was heavy, her pride slowly crumbling under the gaze of dozens of strangers. The bank teller, a young woman in her late 20s with glossy nails and a smug smile, leaned back in her chair, tapping her long nails against the counter. She tilted her head and raised her eyebrows, as if daring the old woman to prove her worth. "Excuse me?" The elderly woman's voice shook, though she tried to steady it. "I've been banking here for over 20 years. My money is here. I just need to withdraw a little to—" The teller interrupted with a chuckle that wasn't funny. "Over 20 years? Lady, this ID of yours looks like it's from another century. Are you sure it's even valid?" A few customers in line snickered under their breath. Others frowned but said nothing. The bank's marble walls and tall glass windows amplified every word, making the humiliation echo louder. The old woman swallowed hard. She had never begged for anything in her life. She had worked as a maid, as a cook, as a cleaner, saving every penny, enduring back-breaking labor so that her children and grandchildren could have better lives. Every coin in her account represented sleepless nights, blistered hands, and sacrifices no one in that bank would ever understand. And yet here she was, being treated like a beggar, like a fraud. Her trembling hand slowly pulled her ID from the bag and slid it across the counter. "This is me," she said softly. "It has always been me. Please, check again." The teller snatched the card, rolling her eyes, and waved it in the air as though it were some cheap piece of plastic from a toy store. "I'll check," she said, her tone exaggerated, "but don't get your hopes up." The woman's chest tightened. She hated drawing attention, but now every eye in the bank seemed locked on her. The guard near the door muttered something to another employee, and both chuckled quietly. The sound stung worse than the teller's words. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. The truth was, the elderly woman didn't come to the bank often. She didn't need much. She lived in a tiny apartment, cooked simple meals, and cherished evenings when her grandchildren came to visit. Her life was humble but filled with love. Today she only needed to withdraw enough money to buy her medication. Just her pills, that was all. Pills that kept her blood pressure steady. Pills that gave her the strength to keep going. And yet, instead of compassion, she was facing ridicule. Her lips trembled as she whispered, almost to herself, "Lord, give me strength." But the teller wasn't done. She leaned forward and raised her voice louder than necessary, making sure the whole bank heard. "You know, some people try to scam banks all the time. They pretend to be someone else, use old documents, try to sneak money out that doesn't belong to them. That's why we're strict." The woman gasped, her eyes widening. Scam? Pretend? She had worked honestly her whole life. She had never stolen a dime. Her reputation in her neighborhood was spotless. The mere suggestion that she could be a thief broke her heart. The line of customers grew restless. Some sighed, impatient. One man muttered, "Come on, hurry up already," as though she was deliberately wasting their time. She wanted to turn around, explain herself to the strangers staring at her, tell them how hard she had worked, how much she had given, how unfair this was. But the words stuck in her throat. Her pride wouldn't allow her to plead for dignity. Her knees trembled under the weight of invisible judgment. She gripped the counter tightly to keep herself standing. Memories flooded her mind in flashes. She remembered the nights she worked as a cleaner in office buildings, mopping floors until midnight, while her children slept at home. She remembered the mornings she stood at bus stops in the freezing cold, heading to jobs where people barely noticed her presence. She remembered the Sundays when her only joy was singing hymns at church, her voice trembling but filled with faith. Every penny she earned went into her savings account, this very bank account. That account was her lifeline, her safety, her proof that all her sacrifices weren't in vain. And now this young teller, who probably hadn't worked a hard day in her life, was stripping that dignity away, one cruel remark at a time. The woman's eyes blurred with tears. She blinked rapidly, not wanting anyone to see her cry. But the emotions were too strong. A single tear rolled down her cheek, glistening in the bright lights of the bank. Still, the teller showed no mercy. She smirked, tapped loudly on her keyboard and said, I'm not seeing much here. Are you sure you belong in this bank? Maybe you should go to a different branch, if you even have an account." The words hit like a slap across the face. The old woman's voice cracked as she tried one last time. "Please, it's my money. I just need a little. Please don't treat me this way." But her plea only seemed to fuel the teller's arrogance. She leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and looked at the elderly woman as if she were invisible, as if her life didn't matter. The humiliation was complete, and around her the crowd stayed silent, watching, waiting, too afraid or too indifferent to step in. The silence in the bank was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic clicking of keyboards and the faint hum of the air conditioner. But around the elderly woman at the counter the silence felt cruel, thick with judgment, whispers, and eyes that refused to look away. The line of customers stretched almost to the door. Men in suits glanced at their watches impatiently. Women held handbags tightly. Teenagers scrolled on their phones, and mothers tried to hush restless children. Yet all of them, in one way or another, were watching the drama unfold. At the center of it all was the old woman. Her thin frame looked even smaller under the harsh fluorescent lights. She stood alone, trembling slightly, as the teller's words, sharp and dismissive, rang through the hall like accusations. "Are you sure this account is even yours?" the teller repeated, her voice laced with suspicion. The old woman's lips quivered, but she tried to stay calm. "Please, I've been with this bank for many years. This is my account. I only need to withdraw a little." Her words were gentle, humble, but instead of sympathy, they were met with impatience. A man near the back of the line groaned loudly. "Come on. Some of us have places to be." His voice carried through the room, and a few others nodded in agreement. To them, she was just an obstacle, a delay in their busy day. The old woman's cheeks burned with shame. She wasn't trying to hold anyone up. She wasn't trying to be a burden. All she wanted was her own money, money she had earned honestly through years of labor. But to these strangers, she was nothing more than an inconvenience. A young couple whispered to each other, the woman shaking her head. "Why don't they just escort her out? She clearly doesn't have it together." The words stabbed deeper than any knife. Her knees weakened, and she tightened her grip on her handbag. Inside were only a few things: her ID, some receipts, a photo of her late husband, and a folded piece of paper with a list of her medications. Each item was precious, a piece of her life. And yet, in that moment, it felt like even her life story wasn't enough to convince these people she belonged. The teller leaned back in her chair, smirking as though the old woman's pain was a source of entertainment. She tapped her nails on the counter in rhythm, making the humiliation last longer. "Ma'am, we don't have time for games," the teller said, raising her voice just enough so everyone could hear. "If you can't provide proper proof, I'll have to ask you to leave." The security guard near the entrance chuckled, shaking his head. He whispered something to another employee, and they both laughed quietly, glancing at the woman. She caught the look, and her heart sank. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about dignity, respect, humanity, and right now she had none. The old woman's eyes filled with tears, and she blinked rapidly to keep them from falling. She didn't want to cry in front of strangers. She didn't want them to see her broken. But the weight of years of struggle, the years of being underestimated, mistreated, and overlooked, all of it pressed down on her chest. She remembered raising her children alone after her husband passed away. She remembered working long nights, cleaning offices while others slept, just to put food on the table. She remembered saving little by little, penny by penny, to create a cushion for herself in her old age. And now, in the very place where her money was kept safe, she was being treated like a criminal. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some people clearly saw the cruelty, but chose silence. A man in a grey suit frowned, his jaw tight, but he said nothing. A young mother hugged her child closer, whispering, "Don't stare, honey." They all saw it. They all knew it was wrong, but none of them wanted to get involved. That was the worst part, not just the teller's humiliation, but the silence of the crowd, the silence of those who knew better, but refused to act. The old woman's voice cracked as she tried again. "Please, I need this money. It's for my medicine." Her words were barely more than a whisper, but they carried a weight that made a few people in line glance away, ashamed. Medicine, not luxury, not indulgence, just the bare necessity to keep her alive. Yet the teller's face remained stone cold. "I already told you, ma'am. Without proper proof, you're not getting anything." One teenage boy, standing with his headphones around his neck, shifted uncomfortably. He whispered to his friend, "Why are they treating her like that? She's just old." His friend shrugged. "Not our problem." The phrase echoed like thunder in the woman's ears. Not our problem. Her heart ached. Wasn't this society's problem? Wasn't human decency everyone's responsibility? She wasn't asking for charity. She wasn't begging for handouts. She was only asking for what was hers. And yet, surrounded by dozens of people, she had never felt more alone. Her vision blurred as another tear slid down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away with the back of her hand, hoping no one noticed. But they did. Everyone did. Some looked at her with pity, others with annoyance, but not one voice rose to defend her. It was as if she were invisible, her decades of hard work and sacrifice erased in an instant. The bank felt colder than ever. The marble floors reflected the harsh fluorescent lights, casting her shadow back at her, a shadow that looked fragile, almost broken. Her trembling fingers clutched the edge of the counter for support. She felt her strength slipping, her dignity fading with every second that passed. The teller sighed dramatically, clearly enjoying the attention. "Ma'am, please step aside. You're holding up the line." The words shattered her. Step aside. As though her very presence was an inconvenience. As though she didn't matter. Her throat tightened. She wanted to scream, to tell everyone her story, to make them see her worth. But instead, her voice came out small, fragile. "Please, don't treat me this way." The room was silent. The crowd stared, and the humiliation reached its peak. She had spent her entire life carrying others, her children, her family, even her community. But in this moment, no one was there to carry her. No one. And that perhaps was the greatest cruelty of all. "Is this how you treat an elderly woman?" The voice came deep, commanding, and sharp enough to slice through the tension that had gripped the bank like a vice. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that demanded attention. Every head turned, every whisper died. The teller froze, her smug expression faltering. The security guard straightened in his chair. Even the impatient customers in line stopped shifting and looked toward the source of the voice. And there he was. A tall, broad-shouldered man stood a few steps away, his presence filling the room like a sudden storm. A black leather jacket clung to his muscular frame, his clean-shaven head catching the fluorescent light. His face was instantly recognizable, even to those who had only seen him on movie posters or in high-speed car chases on screen. It was Vin Diesel. For a moment, the bank seemed to forget how to breathe. Murmurs broke out among the crowd. "Wait, is that... Oh my God, it's Vin Diesel! No way. What's he doing here?" Some people instinctively reached for their phones, trying to capture the moment, but Vin didn't care about them. His focus was locked entirely on the trembling grandmother at the counter. She had turned her head slightly at the sound of his voice, her tear-stained face full of disbelief. She blinked rapidly, as if unsure whether she was dreaming. Vin's expression was serious, almost fierce, as he stepped closer. His voice, low but steady, filled the hall. "I've been standing here watching this, and I can't believe what I just heard." The teller stuttered, her arrogance quickly draining away. Sir, I was just following protocol." "Protocol?" Vin cut her off, his tone razor-sharp. "There's a difference between protocol and humiliation. Don't confuse the two." The words hung heavy in the air. People glanced at one another nervously, ashamed for having stood by in silence. The elderly woman lowered her eyes, overwhelmed by the unexpected defense. For the first time that day, she felt a flicker of hope. Vin Diesel stepped right up to the counter, standing tall beside her. His very presence seemed to shield her from the cruelty that had been suffocating her moments ago. He gently placed a hand on her shoulder, steadying her. His voice softened slightly as he spoke to her. "Ma'am," he said, looking directly into her weary eyes, "you don't need to explain yourself anymore. You've already been through enough." The woman's lips trembled. I only wanted my money," she whispered, her voice breaking. Vin nodded firmly. "And you will get it, because it's yours. No one has the right to make you feel small for asking for what belongs to you." The words hit her heart like a balm on a wound. For the first time that morning, she felt seen, respected. The teller shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her hands trembling slightly on the keyboard. I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did," Vin said bluntly, his eyes narrowing. "You meant every word you said. You thought you could talk down to her because she's elderly, because she doesn't have the power to fight back, but she does. And right now, she has me." The crowd murmured in awe. The shift in energy was palpable. What had been a room filled with silent complicity was now charged with accountability. The security guard, who had been laughing earlier, avoided Vin's gaze completely, suddenly very interested in the floor. Vin turned to face the rest of the bank. His voice rose, echoing through the hall. "And all of you, what were you doing? Watching? Whispering? Pretending it wasn't your problem?" No one spoke. A few lowered their heads in shame. A mother hugged her child tighter. A man in a suit coughed nervously, his earlier impatience now replaced with regret. Vin continued, his voice steady but full of fire. "This is exactly the problem. We see injustice and we stay quiet. We see someone being humiliated and we look away. Do you know what that makes us? Complicit. Part of the problem." The silence was suffocating now, not because of cruelty, but because of guilt. The elderly woman looked up at him, her eyes glistening with gratitude. In her frail frame, strength began to return, not because the teller had changed her tone, not because the crowd finally realized their shame, but because one man, a stranger, had chosen to stand up for her when no one else would. Her lips quivered as she whispered, "Thank you, son." Vin smiled softly at her, the hardness in his expression melting for a brief moment. "Don't thank me yet. Let's make sure you get your money first." Turning back to the teller, Vin's tone hardened again. "Now, process her withdrawal, properly, and treat her with the respect she deserves." The teller's fingers flew nervously over the keyboard, sweat beading at her temple. She realized now that this wasn't just any customer standing up for the woman. This was Vin Diesel, a man admired worldwide for his roles as a protector, a fighter, a family man. And he wasn't playing a role today. He was dead serious. The crowd began to shift again, but this time not with impatience. Some people looked at the elderly woman with new respect. Others seemed ashamed of their silence. The teenage boy who had earlier muttered, "Not our problem," now whispered, "He's right." And for the first time that morning, the bank no longer felt like a cold, hostile place. It felt like a stage for something greater, a reminder of humanity. Vin Diesel didn't just stand there quietly. He stayed by the old woman's side, a silent protector, his broad frame a wall between her and the cruelty she had endured minutes ago. He wasn't distracted by the flashing phones capturing his every move. He wasn't there for publicity or attention. He was there because it was right. And in a world where people often chose silence, that act alone made him larger than life. The elderly woman looked at him once more, her heart swelling with a mix of relief and disbelief. She had walked into the bank expecting humiliation and loneliness. Instead, she found a guardian in the unlikeliest of places, a Hollywood star who saw her not as a stranger, but as a human being worthy of respect. In that moment, she didn't see Vin Diesel, the celebrity. She saw Vin Diesel, the man, the protector, the voice for those who had none. And it changed everything. Vin Diesel stood tall, his hand still resting gently on the frail shoulder of the elderly woman. His touch wasn't forceful. It was steady, reassuring, like a shield between her and the world that had just tried to break her. She looked up at him with watery eyes, her lips trembling. But in his presence, she felt safer than she had in years. "Ma'am," he said softly, his deep voice carrying the weight of both kindness and conviction, "please don't cry. No one should ever treat you this way." Those words hit her heart harder than anything she had heard in a long time. She had grown used to being invisible, overlooked, dismissed because of her age, her race, her fragile appearance. But now, standing beside a man who could have ignored her just like the rest, she realized she wasn't invisible anymore. The teller shifted nervously in her chair, her fake confidence cracking like glass under pressure. She tried to compose herself, but her words stumbled out. I was only doing my job. You don't understand?" Vin cut her off with a look so sharp that she stopped mid-sentence. His voice dropped low, steady, but firm enough to silence the entire hall. "No. Your job is to serve customers with respect, to help them, not to insult them, not to belittle them, and certainly not to accuse them without reason." The bank fell so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioner again. Customers shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Vin's gaze, because his words weren't just aimed at the teller. They were aimed at everyone who had stood by and watched. The elderly woman clutched her handbag to her chest, her voice trembling. "I only wanted my money. Enough for my medicine." Her confession was simple, fragile, but it carried a weight that pierced the silence like a blade. People in line looked down at their feet, ashamed that they had judged her so quickly, that they had assumed she was wasting their time. Vin's jaw tightened. He turned his full attention to the teller. "Do you hear that? She needs her medicine, and instead of helping her, you made her cry. Do you feel proud of yourself?" The teller stammered, her cheeks burning red. I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did," Vin interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "Because if you didn't mean it, you wouldn't have said it. You thought you could get away with it because she's old, because she's alone, because nobody would stand up for her. But guess what? She's not alone anymore." He gestured toward the woman, his strong hand resting protectively on the counter. "She has me," the crowd murmured again, but this time it wasn't in annoyance. It was in awe. Some nodded slowly, realizing the truth of his words. A young man at the back whispered, "He's right. We should have said something." The security guard, who had laughed earlier, stood frozen in place. He suddenly looked very small compared to the mountain of a man standing before him. Vin Diesel leaned closer to the teller, his voice deep and commanding. "Now listen to me carefully. Do your job. Verify her account properly, process her withdrawal, and hand her the money she came here for. And while you're at it, treat her with the respect she deserves." The teller swallowed hard, her fingers fumbling over the keyboard. Her earlier arrogance was gone, replaced with trembling hands and a pale face. She quickly typed in the woman's information, her eyes widening as the truth flashed on her screen. The elderly woman's account was perfectly valid. Not only valid, but it had more than enough funds. She had been a loyal customer for decades, her balance healthier than many others in the bank. The teller's throat tightened. She realized she had humiliated a woman who had every right to be there, every right to withdraw her own money, and every right to demand respect. Vin wasn't done. He straightened up, turning to face the entire room again. His deep voice carried through the hall like a sermon. "And to all of you, remember this moment. Remember how you stood here and watched a defenseless woman be humiliated. Remember how you stayed quiet because it wasn't your problem. It shouldn't take me or anyone famous to step in. It should take a heart. That's all." The silence was heavier now, but this time it wasn't cruel. It was reflective. The customers shifted uneasily, many of them ashamed. A mother bent down to her child and whispered, "Always speak up when you see something wrong." The elderly woman looked at Vin with tears glistening in her eyes. Not tears of humiliation anymore, but of gratitude. For years she had carried the weight of being overlooked, disrespected, and treated as if she didn't matter. But in this moment, one man's courage had reminded her that she did. The teller finally cleared her throat, her voice shaky. "Her account is valid. She has plenty of funds. I'll process the withdrawal now." Vin raised his eyebrows. "Good. And do it with respect." The teller nodded quickly, typing the final details and preparing the cash. She carefully placed it in an envelope, her hands trembling as she slid it across the counter. The elderly woman hesitated, her hands shaking as she reached for it. Vin placed his hand over hers gently, steadying her. "It's yours," he said softly. "Don't let anyone ever make you doubt that again." She smiled faintly, whispering, "Thank you." The scene had shifted completely. What began as humiliation had become redemption. The woman wasn't leaving with just money in her hand. She was leaving with her dignity restored. But Vin Diesel wasn't satisfied with just fixing the mistake. He wanted to make sure the lesson stuck. He turned back to the teller one last time, his voice calm but firm. "Next time someone like her walks in, remember today. Remember the shame you felt when the truth came out. And never, ever let this happen again." The teller nodded silently, unable to meet his eyes. Then Vin leaned down, speaking softly to the old woman. "You're not alone. Not while I'm around." The woman's heart swelled. It had been years since anyone had defended her so fiercely, spoken for her so powerfully. She held on to her envelope of money, but more importantly, she held on to her dignity. For her, this day wasn't about the withdrawal anymore. It was about the reminder that she still mattered, that her life still carried value, and that kindness still existed, even in the most unexpected of places. And for everyone watching, it was a wake-up call. The bank was still buzzing from the tension Vin Diesel had unleashed. The teller sat stiffly behind her counter. The elderly woman clutched her small envelope of money close to her chest. And the crowd of customers was still frozen, unsure of what to do next. The air was thick, charged, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of what had just happened. Then, suddenly, the glass door of a private office swung open. Out rushed the bank manager, a middle-aged man in a crisp navy blue suit, his tie slightly loosened, his forehead beaded with nervous sweat. He had been alerted by the commotion, and though he hadn't seen it all, he could already sense trouble. Trouble he couldn't ignore. And when his eyes landed on Vin Diesel standing at the counter, broad shoulders towering over everyone else, his heart skipped a beat. "Oh no," he muttered under his breath, before quickly plastering on a fake smile. "Mr. Diesel, what an unexpected honor. I'm so sorry for whatever inconvenience you've experienced." Vin turned, his gaze steady and sharp. "This isn't about me," he said, pointing to the frail woman beside him. "It's about her. She came here for her money, and instead got humiliated, disrespected, and treated like she didn't belong." The old woman lowered her head, still shaken by the ordeal, but Vin's words gave her strength. She gripped her envelope tightly, holding onto it not just as cash, but as proof that her dignity had been restored. The manager's face turned pale. He adjusted his tie nervously and stepped forward, bowing slightly toward the woman. "Ma'am, please forgive us. I assure you this is a misunderstanding, a simple mistake. We value all of our customers." Vin cut him off, his deep voice echoing across the marble floor. "A mistake?" He shook his head slowly. "No, this wasn't a mistake. A mistake is forgetting to carry the one when you're adding. A mistake is misplacing a file. What happened here was deliberate. She was mocked, she was accused, she was made to feel small because someone thought they could get away with it." The manager swallowed hard, his smile faltering. "Mr. Diesel, please, let me assure you, this does not reflect our institution's values." "Don't feed me lines," Vin said firmly, taking a step closer. The room seemed to shrink as his voice grew heavier. "I don't care what your institution claims to value. What I care about is what actually happened. And what happened was cruel, unnecessary, and wrong." The teller shifted in her seat, her face flushed with embarrassment. She tried to speak up, but Vin's glare silenced her instantly. The crowd, which had remained quiet up to now, leaned in closer. Phones were recording, whispers spreading like wildfire. Everyone knew this moment was bigger than just a transaction. It was about accountability. The elderly woman's voice cracked as she spoke, her words directed at the manager. "I've been banking here for over 20 years. My husband and I opened this account together when we still had dreams of buying a house. I've never had a problem. Until today." Her voice trembled, but her words carried truth that no one could deny. Tears welled in her eyes as she added softly, "All I wanted was enough money for my medicine." The manager's face fell. He clasped his hands together, bowing slightly again. "Ma'am, please forgive us. I promise this will never happen again. You are a valued customer. Your loyalty means everything to us." Vin folded his arms across his chest, watching closely. "An apology isn't enough," he said sternly. "What are you going to do to make sure this never happens again? What are you going to do so the next elderly woman who walks in here doesn't leave humiliated with shame?" She cleared her throat and whispered, I'm so sorry, Mum. I shouldn't have spoken to you that way. I was wrong." The old woman looked at her, her heart heavy. She wanted to believe the apology, but the sting of the humiliation still lingered. She simply nodded, unwilling to lower herself further. Vin, however, wasn't satisfied. "Look her in the eyes when you say it," he demanded. The teller swallowed hard, lifting her eyes to meet the grandmother's tearful gaze. "I'm sorry," she said again, this time louder, more genuine. "You didn't deserve that." The elderly woman nodded slowly, her lips trembling as she whispered, "Thank you." The manager quickly jumped back in, eager to control the damage. "Ma'am, as a gesture of our deepest apology, we will personally assign a representative to assist you any time you visit this branch. You will never again have to wait in line or deal with unnecessary issues." The old woman blinked in surprise. She had never been offered such treatment before. For years she had been invisible, just another face in the crowd. Now, suddenly, she mattered. But Vin wasn't done. He stepped closer to the manager, lowering his voice but making sure the whole room could still hear. "She doesn't need special treatment. She just needs respect. That's all any human being deserves. You don't need to bend over backward. You just need to treat people the way you'd want your mother or grandmother to be treated." The manager nodded quickly, his face red with embarrassment. "You're right. You're absolutely right." The atmosphere in the bank shifted again. What had begun as a humiliating spectacle had turned into a public lesson. Customers who had stood in silence now clapped quietly, some nodding in agreement. Even those who had whispered cruel things earlier looked ashamed of themselves. The elderly woman turned to Vin, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "I thought no one would stand up for me today. I thought I was alone." Vin leaned down, giving her a warm, steady hug. "You're not alone," he whispered. "Not while I'm around. Not while there are still good people willing to speak up." The crowd erupted into gentle applause. A few people wiped their eyes, touched by the scene. The manager, desperate to salvage the bank's reputation, gestured nervously. "Mr. Diesel, perhaps we could handle this privately." Vin shook his head firmly. "No, this shouldn't be hidden. Everyone here needs to see what just happened. Everyone needs to remember that standing up for what's right doesn't require fame, money, or power. It just requires courage." The crowd fell silent again, absorbing his words. The elderly woman held her envelope close, but more importantly, she held on to her pride, her dignity, restored in full. And though the bank manager apologized, though the teller lowered her head in shame, it wasn't their words that healed her heart. It was Vin Diesel's courage, his refusal to stay silent, his decision to defend her when no one else would. That was what she would remember for the rest of her life. Oh. The air outside the bank was different from the suffocating tension inside. A cool breeze brushed through the streets, carrying with it the whispers of what had just taken place. People filed out slowly, some still talking, others silent, each replaying the scene in their heads. What had begun as an ordinary morning at the bank had turned into a story none of them would ever forget. Vin Diesel walked beside the elderly woman, his large frame contrasting with her fragile body. Yet the way he carried her small handbag, carefully, respectfully, as if it were a priceless treasure, told the world everything about the man he truly was. Cameras flashed. A small crowd had gathered outside, people who had heard rumors that Vin Diesel is at the bank. But what they witnessed was not a movie star signing autographs. It was a man using his voice, his influence, and his heart to defend someone society had overlooked. The grandmother, still clutching her envelope of cash, looked up at Vin. Her eyes glistened with tears, but this time they weren't tears of humiliation. They were tears of gratitude. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered softly, her voice carrying the weight of decades of silence. "You didn't have to defend me. Most people would have just walked away." Vin stopped walking, turning to face her fully. His deep voice was calm but firm. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. And the truth is, you should never have needed me to step in. Someone else should have spoken up. Everyone in that room should have spoken up. But they didn't. And that's the real problem." The grandmother nodded, her face etched with wisdom. "The world has a way of making people look the other way. But today, you reminded them to look closer." Around them, the crowd grew. People who had stood in line earlier were now whispering, some embarrassed, some inspired. A young mother holding her toddler leaned closer to another customer. "I'll never forget this. I just stood there watching. I should have said something." An older man with a cane added, "We've all gotten too used to ignoring things that don't affect us directly. But watching that woman cry today, it hit me hard." It was as though Vin's words inside the bank had cracked something open inside these people. Their silence had been exposed, and now they were wrestling with it. Vin turned to them, raising his voice just enough so the circle of onlookers could hear. "You all saw what happened in there. You saw her being humiliated. You heard the words that cut her down, and most of you said nothing." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. A few people lowered their eyes, ashamed. Vin continued, his tone passionate, each word heavy with truth. "I'm not here to shame you. I'm here to wake you up. Because the next time you see something like that, you don't need me to be there. You don't need a celebrity. You don't need a hero. You just need to be human enough to stand up and say, 'This isn't right.'" The grandmother nodded slowly beside him, her frail hand gripping his arm for strength. The moment stretched into something bigger than a single bank, bigger than one elderly woman's humiliation. It became a mirror held up to everyone present, forcing them to ask themselves, what kind of person am I when faced with injustice? Do I stay silent, or do I speak up? A teenager in the crowd lifted his phone, recording. "This is going to go viral," he whispered. "Not because it's Vin Diesel, but because it's real." And he was right. Within hours, the video would spread online. Not as a flashy celebrity headline, but as a powerful reminder of kindness, dignity, and courage. People would see it and ask themselves uncomfortable but necessary questions. As the cameras buzzed and whispers grew louder, Vin gently leaned down to the grandmother. "Do you want me to walk you home?" Her lips curved into a soft smile. "No, son. You've already carried me further than you know. I can walk the rest of the way." Vin squeezed her hand. "You're stronger than anyone in that bank gave you credit for. Don't ever forget that." She looked at him, her eyes shining with pride. "And you're kinder than most people know. They see the action star, the tough guy. But today, I saw your heart, and that's the part I'll remember." For a moment, they simply stood there, two people from completely different worlds, yet united by something timeless. Humanity. When Vin finally walked away, the grandmother watched him disappear down the street. He didn't wave for cameras. He didn't smile for publicity. He simply walked away quietly, like a man who had done what needed to be done, nothing more. But the ripples of his actions remained. Inside the bank, the staff gathered in the manager's office, their faces pale and uneasy. "We can't let this happen again," the manager admitted. "This isn't just about customer service. It's about basic respect." One of the younger employees whispered, "If Vin Diesel hadn't walked in today, we might not have even realized how bad it was." The manager sighed. "That's the problem. We should have realized, with or without him." And so, changes began. New training programs were scheduled, policies were revised. Staff were reminded that behind every account number, every ID card, every transaction, was a human being who deserved dignity. The grandmother returned home that evening, her small apartment filled with the soft glow of a lamp. She placed her envelope of cash on the table, but her eyes lingered not on the money, but on the memory of what had happened. She sat in her favorite chair, the one by the window, and whispered to herself, "Today, someone saw me. Today, someone reminded the world that I matter." Her heart felt lighter. For years she had carried silent scars of being overlooked, of being treated as less than. But now, she carried something else. The memory of a man who refused to let her be invisible. And she hoped the world had learned something too. The story of the elderly woman at the bank spread across social media, news outlets, and living rooms. But at its core, it wasn't really about Vin Diesel. It was about the truth he voiced out loud. That every act of kindness matters. That every person deserves respect. That silence in the face of cruelty makes you part of the problem. Injustice doesn't need a movie star to fight it. It needs ordinary people. People like you, people like me, to decide that enough is enough. So the next time you witness someone being mistreated, disrespected, or humiliated, remember this story. Remember the grandmother's tears. Remember Vin's words. And most of all, remember that doing nothing is a choice. Choose better.